Zeitgeist, meaning spirit or mood of the time, is the film of the time. Produced as a personal creative project, it was made available on the internet and quickly became a global phenomenon. Its comprehensive coverage of the facts behind religion, 911 and the finance system caused such an explosion in popularity that Google's video counters reached their limits at 50 million views. In October 2008, the second film, Zeitgeist Addendum, was released, covering the banking system, its negative effects on humanity, and designs for an alternative, new and improved future. Peter Joseph, director of Zeitgeist and Zeitgeist Addendum, talks with us about his reasons and inspirations for creating both films and his hopes for the future of humankind. Hi Peter, thank you so much for finding the time to talk to us today. I know you've had a really busy schedule while you've been in England. Obviously we're here to talk about Zeitgeist, Zeitgeist Addendum.
Thank you for having me.
It's fantastic, we're so pleased about that. First, before we kind of jump into Zeitgeist, I'd really just, if you could just tell me a little bit about yourself, what you do, your background, and why you started this project.
Well, as a commercial producer in New York, it was very unfulfilling for the most part. And it's you know, you walk the line, you have your job, as anyone does. Yeah. And ultimately, I've always had other aspirations creatively, so I always engaged in other projects, such as filmmaking projects and off-Broadway projects and multimedia projects. So I had a pattern of doing this independently on my own in New York, even though it was never really for money or anything like that.
Yeah.
And as time went on, I started to realize that there's a lot of really terrible, sinister issues going on in the world. And I decided that it would be to my advantage and to the advantage of society, and actually to my own satisfaction, to do something that would have not just an artistic element for the sake of art, but something that would actually be beneficial to the system, because art without conscience in a lot of ways is kind of meaningless, I've come to find. I think as time moves forward, you look back at what contributions of art have really endured. They actually have a great presence to them as far as how they relate to the human condition. So as you go back to J.S. Bach and the church, and all of these elements that come forward with art that has a relevance to it outside of just for the sake of art. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So a painting not for the sake of painting, for a painting for the sake of actually communicating something about humanity and the social condition of the time, perhaps. So Zeitgeist was an attempt to combine my artistic interests with some social cause, so social interest. And I think what triggered it was 9/11, because of how catastrophic the event was, and then as time went on, information began to come out about how ridiculous the government's account of the story was, and then you began to see who actually gained from this as time went on with the wars and the corporations. So my initial trigger for Zeitgeist, the original movie, was 9/11, so to speak. And then as I was approaching this to create an artistic work representing it, which, by the way, the original Zeitgeist was shown as a multimedia work in Lower Manhattan initially, with no intent to be an actual release at all. It was shown for 6 nights for free to an activist group that came in, and then it was thrown up online afterwards, and then it just happened to erupt with interest.
Exploded.
Which, by the way, it put me in a very precarious position because I didn't own the rights to a certain amount of it, and it was all friends I had made in the movement and things like this, so I had to retroactively go through this big mess. So anyway, but as far as the film itself, religion was always very interesting to me ever since I was a child. I was never raised in a really rigid religious environment, but I was around it to a certain degree. My families were very Catholic. My parents were not particularly religious, but
I was raised as Catholic also.
Right. And I went to a Catholic school for a little while, so I got to experience this, and as a child there was always something strange to me. Like in one class I'd be in science, and then in one class I'd go to this little church situation, and even at a young age there was a strange dichotomy to me that didn't make any sense. And not to say that all religions don't have a value, they actually all very much do historically, and a lot of people that see the film, they get the wrong impression about what I'm trying to say about religion. In the first film I deal with the history of religion. That's sort of a history that no one really talks about because it's not the established representation.
Pattern.
Right.
I must admit, when I first watched that myself, I was absolutely flabbergasted when you show how the Christ religion and how many others came in under a very, very similar situation, and that absolutely knocked my socks off, because I never knew anything like that.
Yeah, the dying and resurrecting God-man.
That's right.
Has been going on for millennia, for ages. And it's a symbolic rebirth, as early pagan ideology. It's where you're born again. All these
goes right to the Druidism and the solar cross.
Oh, absolutely.
The birth of the sun.
It's age old, exactly, and it has multiple symbolisms apart from the sun as being its core. Like astrotheology is the terminology used to describe this stellar and solar element that has basically been transmuted and transformed into the historical religions that we think these attributes are actual history. When if you look far enough back, you see that it's basically pure allegory. And that even though there were certain characters that emerged historically, say in Christianity, there probably was somebody that fulfilled some role that this Christ character was assumed. But by the time the Bible came to fruition, the Christ character was transformed into a totally mythological figure. So there really isn't a historical element. There's no documentation of a historical Christ. And that's very challenged, of course.
So where do we stand with the Bible? Because there's so many books in there, talking about the Christ. So I guess you must have miffed off a lot of Christians when you put this out there.
And they misinterpret, I believe, because even if he didn't exist, it doesn't matter. It's the message.
It's the message. It is the message, yes.
They shouldn't be... I don't believe... Religion has a propensity towards materialism. They don't call it materialism. But they hold on to something, and they really can't break away from it, and that's the definition of materialism in my mind. So to think that just because this character didn't exist, this demeans the whole thing is not necessarily the case. If you want to drive for pure superstition, then yes, it is the case. Which of course I don't advocate. I think philosophy is much more important than. Well, obviously philosophy. Superstition is a derogatory sort of term, but when it comes to these notions of the man dying for your sins, I think these are misconstrued. I think there's no real relevance to it, and it's based on this sort of control mechanism that you're guilty the moment you're born, and he died for your sins thousands of years. Yes, it's distorted on one side, and then there's also kernels of truth that speak to the human condition. Love the neighbor.
So everything kind of gets mixed up together.
It does, and it's to speak a little bit more about that. The Christ character is very much composite because there's a lot of dichotomy in his rhetoric. In one passage he says, "I don't bring peace, I bring the sword. I want to have your neighbor against neighbor," and in another passage it's love thy neighbor and love your enemies.
So it's a bit of a mixed message, isn't it, really?
Well, because it's a composite text, and that makes sense. You find these dichotomies, these yin and yangs happening all through lots of different God-men that have existed. So that's why it's even more proof that it's
on the research that you've done with all these different characters in history who've come in as religious leaders, icons. Which ones would you say actually really do you believe did exist?
As far as the major religions, I think it's obvious that the later religions, there's someone, Muhammad existed. That's well documented by historians. But the farther you go back, the more the characters become more elusive in their definition. Buddha, I'd question if Buddha existed. His symbology is extremely solar. Just like Krishna. And these, of course, are thousands of years before Christ. So, I think that it's just almost, I don't really focus on it, frankly. I don't think if they exist or not it matters, but if you go back far enough, there's really no historical documentation secular. So if you can't find that, then all you're kind of looking at is the faith-based texts, which are inherently biased because of what they actually are. So I really couldn't tell you. I think obviously there's the Allah didn't exist per se. It's the God that was this redefined element from the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then Muhammad, I guess, definitely did exist because it was not that far along. It was 800, 900 years after Christ, and there are actual historical documentations. I think he's been interpolated, just as all of them have. They've all been. They take the prior faiths and they just build upon it. They're emergent culminations, but the characters are in the stories. You tend to find this throughout all religious texts, even to I think to modern religions, that you find all sorts of strange things in things like Scientology, things like this that continue these types of patterns. So I think the sadness to me is that most religions are arrogant and they don't realize that they're interconnected. And I think if they realized they were interconnected, then there wouldn't be so much dispute. I mean, the problem with religious texts in general is that they're semantically interpreted. Christianity alone has about 34,000 different subgroups, and they are slightly at odds with each other. You know, the Seventh-day Adventists, you know, they all have these tiny little variations of their interpretation. I believe that's very dichotomous, and in the end, my major argument towards religion is that it's completely divisive of humanity. So it's not progressive. It has kernels of truth, but I think it's time most move beyond these dogmas and these faiths that really tend to separate humanity, because nothing's going to come positive out from that type of awareness.
Well, I was talking, funny enough, to someone the other day about this, like we all want to work together as one humanity, but it's like there's groups, and then there's groups within groups. As I was saying to someone the other day, you're pink and I'm blue. We're still trying to aim for the same thing, but it just dissects people all the time. And in this culture where the world is becoming a smaller place, it's so sad that we're not coming together and we seem to be spreading further apart.
Somewhat.
Yeah, and it's really sad that, you know, everybody is in their own camp and they don't want to come together.
Right. Because
there's one slight difference.
Sure, everyone sees the differences between each other, and they tend not to see the similarities. In the new film, I have a quote by Carl Sagan, which is very nice. He's like, if an extraterrestrial visitor came to the planet, they would probably recognize all the similarities between the species and tend to see as the differences as trivial, because we all function in the same environment.
Exactly.
We all have the same needs fundamentally. So I think it's a flaw of consciousness that's happened. And I would say, to give it a rhetorical kind of notion, we're barely out of the jungle on this planet as far as consciousness.
Exactly.
So, you know, I think through time, and that's why I've made the films that I do, I talk about the topics that I do, people will realize that this infighting, and I think it slightly comes from the restrictions of our language, because in order for me to describe something to you, I have to separate things into words. You know, this is a table, this is a glass. So division is inherent in our cognitive awareness, but we haven't reached the spiritual awareness enough to know that even though this is a glass, it's still made of the same thing as this table, and the fact that it's separate from this table is actually quite suspect. It just looks that way because of our five-sense reality. Molecularly, when you get into quantum mechanics and, you know, high levels of science, it's more of like a sea of molecules that sort of intermerge, and, like, you know, there's different things that happen over time spans that are so vast that we can't really recognize, so we don't see them. Like, if I have my hand on here long enough, it's going to make an imprint on this table through the chemicals that will emerge and come together. So there's no separation. It's an illusion that there's any type of separation.
Just as we're on that subject, I know it's kind of slightly going off the beaten track, but talking about things making an imprint, sound and vision, ghosts. I know I've thrown it into the pot there, but things are being recorded, like we're recording this now.
Right.
That's something that could come in where things are stuck in time and then something triggers it off. Yeah. What do you think about that?
I've never given much thought to that specifically, but I think there's a lot of possibilities out there that we don't have the ability to recognize. The problem with the human mind typically is that we only see what we've been conditioned to see. And I mean that very literally. There's been tests done, psychological tests, where you can have a picture, and one side of it will be, inside the picture will be multiple symbologies, and they'll gauge, you know, someone's mentality, someone's particular state of mind at that point. So say someone's angry, and they show this picture, the person will immediately recognize the negative attribute in the picture. If someone's happy, they find the positive attribute in the picture. So I think we project like crazy. So things that are outside of our general consciousness, I think the reason that they're not recognized by many is because they don't have the vocabulary to recognize it. So phenomenon that would be considered, you know, supernatural, to whatever that might mean. But I would say, generally speaking, that everything is natural. There's no such thing as supernatural. It's only supernatural to the extent that it seems out of it seems out of the ordinary. So things like a ghost, whatever that is, you know, which we say something like that, we have a cognitive notion of what it could be, but, you know, these figments that could occur could actually be many, many different things, and most that would experience that are too closed to recognize that in general.
Exactly.
So
well, I always liken it to, my expression has always been, it's a higher science that we haven't quite discovered
sure.
how it works yet.
Right.
You know, when we say, like you say, supernatural phenomena, and then somewhere further on down the line it's explained, and then people go, oh, that's how it works.
Yeah, just like back in the old days, you know, they thought that ghosts would possess you and give you illnesses, and
yeah, we've moved on a bit since then, I hope.
well, yeah, and we will continue to move on and discover all sorts of nuances of unexplained things that will eventually be explained by understandings and technological understandings that we can recognize. I think it's an obvious pattern, and that's the unique thing about knowledge. There's no such thing as tangible knowledge, or there's no such thing as a smart person. It's just a matter of time before everything we know is basically transformed or eradicated. And
that's right. Well, it's like a child being in nursery school as opposed to a professor being in a university. It's just that professor has had the time to learn everything that he's learned. So it doesn't mean to say that the child, because he's ignorant of knowledge, will not reach that status at one point in his life.
Right.
And also, like, we're talking about frequencies, and what you just said before was, we see what we want to see,
very often,
you know, because a lot of the time we block things out because possibly it's just too much for our brains to want to take in. We just don't want the knowledge.
Right.
And it just reminds me of a story. I don't know if you've heard this, and I think it might have been Paul McKenna. I'm not sure, a hypnotist over here. I don't know if you've heard of Paul McKenna.
No.
And he was on stage, and there was a chap where he had this watch on, and there was the child was in front of, like, the hypnotist, and he's saying what's on the watch, but he couldn't see because the child was there, but he could see right through the child to see what the inscription on the watch was. So how could he do that?
That's fascinating.
So the hypnotist made him block out what was in front of him, the child, which was blocking the view to the watch, and he could see right through it. He could give the inscription and everything, and I was just absolutely amazed by that. So it just goes to show that you can tune and see, going on to the molecular level.
Sure.
So you can see through the fog, as they might say.
Right.
And just as we're sort of on that subject of seeing the real picture, because this is what we're talking about today with Zeitgeist, is seeing the real picture. I feel like, I mean, I don't know if you feel like this, that sometimes we are just being tuned in on a frequency just so all we see is what certain bodies want us to see.
Well, sure. That, I think you could say the mass media does that on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So, you know, they've created this illusion of terrorism,
exactly,
which is statistically irrelevant. You know, as far as the odds of any of us dying in a terrorist act are virtually zero. But yet, you turn on the television, and that seems to be a very common topic continuously. And then they change, you know, the language. So now the war in, say, Iraq is no longer a war against, you know, insurgents. It's a war against terrorism. So then you have this nonsense that's perpetually built upon. And they did the same thing, you know, with communism. You know, they did the same. They just need these enemies, you know, for that example. But the media tells us what to think, and it creates a state of mind, and we tend to absorb that and create an identity with it, and then we end up projecting it. So, and that's the thing about we're so influenced that we have to be very careful in how we behave in multiple levels. And that's one of the things about consciousness that many don't really realize. Coming to the new film, one of the things that I talk about is the free market system, or what I call more generally the monetaryism as a general distinction, which is more of an invented word, where all societies, doesn't matter what they are, if they're communist or socialist or even fascist or free market, capitalist, they all have the same type of competitive structure inherently, because it's still exists. We all exist within scarcity. So there's a taking mechanism that comes naturally in the environment. I don't say naturally because that's the way we are. There's this debate, of course, between human nature and human behavior, nature versus nurture, these attributes. And I tend to find in my understanding, this brings me back to this point on the awareness, is that it's I'd say 90% behaviorism is what conducts what we do. In other words, our environment dictates what we, how we communicate. Obviously, you know, I could be born in the Middle East, and I could be born to a Muslim family, and odds are I would be speaking Arabic and be Muslim. So, like, for example, religion, as in regards to this type of, regards to the same point that we're discussing, as far as this brainwashing, so to speak, is the way I would put it, sort of conditioning, which will be touched upon. It's completely arbitrary to, as far as the established religions. There's no, if you're born in this area, you're most likely going to be in that religion. So most people don't think that way, you know, which I find fascinating. But anyway, that's a little bit of a sidetrack from what I meant to say as far as the free market capitalism and everything else. We live in an environment that rewards competitive and chiseling mentalities, parasitic mentalities, where all of our established institutions, in order to survive, they have to get money. In order to get money, they have to basically fight for it one way or another. They don't call it fighting; they call it negotiation, or they call it this and that.
Clever words.
Yes, but what it really is, it's the whole species is divided in this us against them type of element on a daily basis. Just because, in order to survive, you have to do certain things for your own self-interest. You have to take, as opposed to give. And the difference, I think, is that our environment now has conditioned us into this overwhelmingly selfish mentality that really has reached the point where things like the corruption of the Iraq War and say a cat burglar, there's no difference whatsoever. We start with, you know, this general type of, I broke my thought there for a second, but there's no difference between someone who is a cat burglar needing to survive because they come from scarcity, or more specifically saying, where I come from, you know, like South Central Los Angeles, there's no jobs, everyone sells drugs, they're addicted to drugs because they're upset because they're in this hard environment of poverty. So they do what they have to do to survive. There's no difference between that type of criminal behavior and then, say, the high corporate elite that chooses to invade a country to take its resources and take it over and to create, you know, all the elements that it wants for its own personal gain. It's the same mechanism, and I think that's something that hasn't been realized, and it's the environment that's to blame for all of this. Granted, survival is inherent, it's a genetic basis that we want to live, but how we conduct our living is based on what we've been taught as far as what the necessity is. So back to my original point is that everything is taken in the system, one way or another, or manipulated. You manipulate your environment to get what you need one way or another. If I want a job, I have to go in and convince the boss that I need that job. If the boss wants to give me a low wage, he has to convince me that for some reason that they have to give me this wage. I have to convince, you know, if I go and I have to compete with someone else that needs the job. You could twist this around into all sorts of, you know, seemingly endless spirals of, like, that's just the way it is and it's okay, it's not really corrupt, because I get these arguments all the time.
But it changes the person, doesn't it? Because it's like you say, you have to become vicious to get that job. Yes, you do.
And people say, well, you know, you don't have to get that job there, but actually everyone has to work one way or another. This is one of those things in the system that no one talks about, and the mechanism is this manipulative, chiseling, parasitic, taking type of mentality. And my original point, which I've jumped around a lot, is that I think the conscious awakening has to occur when people realize that it's giving and not taking that is the key. So in a new society, which is what I advocate in the new film, the shift would have to be that people realize that their integrity is only as good as the integrity of everything else around them. For example, if I'm walking down the street and I see a homeless person, I know that through time that there might be a propensity for that homeless person to commit crime because they have to survive. They might have to rob people, they might have to do what they have to do. And when pushed in a corner, like an animal, in fear, you know, they're going to do what they have to do to survive.
Exactly. Fight or flight?
Yeah, sure, yeah. So as long as there's a homeless person or a person that's deprived and abused, perhaps, I'm not safe. And this is something no one really thinks about. And no one's safe in this system in general because it divides everything up. Because there's always the haves and have-nots due to the system. Because there's always edges in the system. There's manipulative edges that certain groups can gain. It's inherent. It's inherently corrupt, basically, is the way I would describe it. So in order to combat that, in order to combat, say, someone that's going to rob you and hurt you, which is simultaneous to combat the corruption of a ruling elite, it's in my opinion, you have to start altering the environment and altering the consciousness of the people. And to do that, people have to realize that they have to start contributing to the world at large in more of a communal sense. It can't be a selfish mechanism. It can't be survival of the fittest. It can't be, like the old Adam Smith free market ideology of, you preserve yourself and everyone does things for themselves, and therefore society will work out as a whole by some invisible hand, which is what he used to claim. And I'm not putting down Adam Smith. There's a lot of things, good things that he did say. I'm just using that as an example because he's one of these fathers of this free market system. And it's also related to all other forms.
Yeah.
It's not just the free market. People think I'm just attacking capitalism and things like that. I've been working on this concept called the Zeitgeist Movement, which is an attempt at a grassroots, conscious awakening, environmental shift for literally the species, as ambitious as that might sound. You tend to find most movements are politically oriented, they're regional, they're specific to certain things. I've yet to see something that really would attempt to unite humanity, and especially with an actual tangible train of thought, not just, hyperbole of idealism. So after the first film came out, everyone asked me, well, what do we do about these issues? What do we do about these problems? And I thought about it, of course, myself. The film doesn't give much of a first film doesn't give much of an answer to anything like that, except at the very end, when I talk about consciousness in general, the need for people to realize how they're interconnected. Very quickly, I denote that through a few different personalities at the very end, which I actually pick up with in the new film. Things like that. What I found through my research as I was approaching the new film, I discovered was a man named Jacques Fresco and a project called the Venus Project. Jacques Fresco is about 92 years old now. He's been working his entire life thinking about social design, thinking about something that you typically never hear about, where you actually design society to benefit society, as opposed to this kind of environment we're in now, where everything is just kind of a free-for-all with different levels of differential advantage. Everyone wants to sell something. Nothing really gets done in our current society unless money can be made from it. There are all sorts of problems, such as the fact that we think we live in a free society. Well, you might be free enough to step out your door and walk down the street and go buy things, but you're only as free as your purchasing power will allow you to be.
Exactly.
So, it's really, there's no such thing in a monetary system as a free country. It doesn't exist. So you're a slave to a corporate structure, basically, very simply put. And essentially, so Jacques Fresco, he presented new ideas to me that I had never thought about, and it took a long time for me to absorb, like I think a lot of people, when they first hear about these ideas, it takes a very long time for them to realize, because they've been so indoctrinated into this sort of, freedom-oriented capitalist connotation, or free market connotation, where they think that they associate freedom with the fact that they go and they can buy whatever they want. They can buy from, they can choose from 75 types of cereal in a grocery store, but yet there's only 2 political parties in their country.
Exactly.
So there's a massive disconnect.
That's crazy,
and they have no idea that democracy is a complete illusion, because in a true democracy, well, first of all, whatever a true democracy may be is actually to leave to question. But in our system, money rules everything. And all you have to do is look at any campaign across the world, especially in the Western world, to see that money and the financial support coming from financial backers, the financial industry itself, such as in America, we have Barack Obama now, who's heavily backed by Wall Street. He completely destroyed McCain and his financial backing. His funding is heavily financial and corporate. They put people in power that support the industry at large. The United States, for example, is just a large corporation.
Of course it is.
And just like the UK or anything
And if
else.
people can't say that, then they really need to open their eyes.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that people don't really think about much, is the real problem of money itself. And this is what Jacques Fresco thought about. And in his final conclusions that I found, it made perfect sense to me. It's that you can't have balance or equality or a world without poverty or a world without war or any of these sort of utopian Christian ideals that people think about in a very traditional sense. Like, why can't we have people living, this and that in a balanced, classless, non-hierarchical, non-elitist type of environment? Why is it the elite always come to fruition? And to really figure it out, you didn't recognize that the biggest tool, the biggest catalyst of this is the monetary system, because it perpetuates stratification. It perpetuates greed. It perpetuates poverty. It perpetuates scarcity. Very quickly, one of the many things I learned about the Venus Project, very quickly, is that the monetary system creates scarcity because scarcity is rewarded. So you can never have a world of abundance. You can never have a world where everyone's fed, because in such an environment, no one can make money off of it inherently. So scarcity and deprivation is built into the system. Corruption is built into the system. So what he began to think about, and what I'm advocating in the new film, which I'm very much in support of, and I have my own trains of thought too, it's not just the Venus Project, and in fact, it isn't just Jacques Fresco, it's this underlying ideology that you have to start designing society to benefit humanity as a whole. And scarily enough, to many people in this fearful New World Order kind of environment of people that think this way, you need a certain degree of technological world unification in order to do so. And when I say this, a lot of people say, whoa, that's like one world government. And if people think about that...
that's been on a lot of people's lips,
yes,
actually.
It has.
They're
they
very scared about how it could go down that path.
Sure, but there's an inherent fallacy to these notions. You need world unification basically because the highest optimization of utilizing the planet would be an organization worldwide. That's why I say technological and intellectual unification. It's not that you break down all the borders and you have, no countries or anything like that. That's not at all. These, first of all, countries are inherently primitive. These are the monetary system. The need for survival is what creates countries, essentially. Countries would exist in the future, hopefully, as a form of organization. It wouldn't be nationalism.
I was going to say that. Who's going to run the show? Who's going to be in charge? We get rid of money, which they're trying to do anyway. They're trying to rule the paper stuff out.
Well, yes, but they're going to have it digitally. They want to have a digital currency.
That does affect a lot of economies if paper goes.
Well, yes. Well, they can't control. The mechanism of paper is traceable, and they used to have the pound used to be supported by gold. And same with the dollar, and now that's been gone. They just have these little things, and they say it's fiat, basically. At least in the States, they do. And eventually, they're going to move forward and eradicate the currency. And eventually, you get to a point where there's no way to trace anything. There's no way to look at the numbers. There's no way to look at the math. Like I can look at the math more or less of the Federal Reserve and see how corrupt in the pyramid scheme that it is. You can look at the inflation. You can look at the depreciation of the dollar. You can look at all the attributes more or less still. And once the financial elite get to a point where they have the technology to do it, they'll make it a complete illusion, which is what it is anyway. Money isn't real. The only thing that's real are resources, and that's what Jacques Fresco recognized. So you have to move past this and realize that resources are really what's important, and until we utilize the resources and utilize our intellectual creativity, which is what creates technology, which is really what everything is in regard to what helps us on a very utility-based level. Everything is technology, from this chair to this. It's just, that is really...
Well, we're just talking about the technology, if I can just jump in there.
Sure.
And I'm fascinated about how do we get rid of the oil and the pollution, and if you can just talk about solar energy and the
geothermal energy.
That's the one.
There's so many different forms of energy out there. To think that we are restricted to oil or anything is only because of the corporate structure.
Yes.
So there's no sustainability in this type of system because there's a need for self-preservation, which inherently is corrupt, because systems that have evolution continues in an emergent cycle, and we discover certain things, and we're always going to discover something better. But what happens in a monetary system is, because money's made off of one institution, they don't want to change. And until they can get the leverage to maneuver themselves, like such as they want to bring in hydrogen into America. Why? Because they can use the same infrastructure as gasoline, as opposed to, say, battery technology, which at this day and age could be unbelievable if they actually maximize the potential of it. Think about how small microchips and everything is. There's no reason that you can't have a battery in a car that could run for eventually 1,000 miles, on one charge. It's just insane to think that we can't do that, because we certainly can. So it's paralyzing, is what the system is. We're paralyzed.
And parasitic.
Yeah, parasitic inherently, but as far as the actual progress, we're paralyzed. So technological progress is restricted because of the monetary system, the need for self-preservation.
But how do we make this jump from
you have to
this Venus project, like the utopia?
Yes, that's the most difficult question, because it's going to take a shift in consciousness. People have to realize what's important. And unfortunately, we have so many dichotomous religions and so many dichotomous worldviews that I'm not ignorant and naive to the difficulty of it, but this is the path. This is what has to happen. You have to have people realize how they're interconnected symbiotically, and then simultaneously realize that everything is emergent and changing. And those are two things that people don't recognize. The arrogance of religion is such where people believe they're separate, they believe they're special, they think that they're different for some reason than a bug or something. And the reality is there's no difference whatsoever. But this is what they've been taught, and this is our primitiveness that perpetuates and keeps us divided, keeps us separated from nature. Because once you step back and realize how we're connected to nature, and again, first of all, we're connected to nature to the effect that everything we do has a cause and effect, and with each other and everything else, and with the environment. Corporate pollution is unbelievable. They don't care about the environment. No one's realizing this. So when we realize that, you realize that in order to live in harmony with nature, you have to actually listen to nature and understand its processes, its natural laws, and align. Like, there's no reason we should do anything that's not sustainable. 75% of most production is waste. So to make anything, it's just, there's so much waste involved. Not to mention, for example, a computer is made out of materials that are only durable to the extent that the market system will allow for them to maintain market share. So the highest form of resources aren't utilized to make things like really long and efficient, because inherently they have to keep market share, so things get more and more cheap.
Everything's meant today to break down.
Planned obsolescence.
Exactly. When I was a child, you would have a hairdryer, for example, and it would just last for ages.
Yeah,
and now everything conks out, for want of a better word.
Yes.
In a year or two, it just breaks down.
Yes.
It's not built to last.
So it's unsustainable.
Unsustainable.
And that's very very hideous for us, because it has so many ramifications, from the landfills to the pollution. So we're totally out of line with nature. So the first thing that has to happen, I think, is that people need to realize that all operations have to be environmentally aware, period. And if you're in a position that it's not, then you're doing something wrong. And the system obviously is wrong when you step back far enough, because you see that the system doesn't reward any of that. So I think when that awareness comes forward, for example, then people will begin to shift. And it's slowly happening, very slowly, unfortunately, because we're still paralyzed by the system. But more tangibly, the first thing I think needs to happen is they need to build a new city. And if you look into the Venus Project, this is one of the things they've advocated. We need to find a place that has, a multi-mile radius, and to build the first circular design, which Fresco has been advocating for years, which is completely self-sustainable, to show how, it could be a test city, so to speak. It could be an amusement park. It could be an experiment to show people what could be if they wanted it to be. So you have everything self-sustaining. You have everything made out of the most prime materials. Granted, we're still going to have to do this within the monetary system, so there'd have to be a lot of financial backing to do it. But it would set this precedent to show, hey, this can be done. We can have an environment where there's virtually no waste. Everything's self-sustainable.
But there is communities like that, though, isn't there?
Small ones.
I've heard of one in Ireland, actually, I think it's called the Unicorn
sort of like a commune type thing?
I think so, yes.
Yeah,
people sort of give up the outside world and go and build a house and live on the farm type of thing.
But that doesn't, because of the need to preserve, because of the financial restrictions of that, because it's still in the monetary system, it doesn't reflect our advancements of technology. So in this particular city, you'd have the highest forms of transportation. You'd have the maglev trains. You'd have no cars whatsoever. Because everything is designed where you can get anywhere you want in the city with extreme ease. You have, there's so many attributes to it. The homes that are made out of materials that are all fireproof. There's no reason to have a fire department because nothing can catch fire. Concepts like this that no one thinks about. Problems in this society are regulated by laws. The idea is actually to eliminate laws. So essentially we have to create an example to show the world what can be done, because most people have no idea what's really technically feasible. And the technology we have today technology is really our divinity, so to speak. It's what we have, it's what we create to make our lives easier. I'm not saying that replaces other forms of spirituality, but tangibly the utility of technology is what creates freedom for us, nothing else. And there's nothing else that I can think of. Money and capitalism, they're tools to get through to make people a little bit more free, but at the cost of subservience and this vast type of class-based division. Everyone who's wealthy does it at the cost of somebody else. Very simply, there's a balance to it, and there's many reasons for that. We need to eliminate that and get an environment designed where people actually live together, and they begin to establish a different train of thought, a different consciousness, where we'll get to a point where people will, first of all, technology will be so advanced that there'll be no monotonous jobs. No one's behind a cash register. Well, there's no money, so there's no reason for that anyway. Most jobs like law would be vanished. There would only be technical issues that would have to be dealt with. You maintain the environment. And eventually people would do that because they want to contribute. They understand what their role is. Not that they want reward from it, not that they want to take. They want to give because they realize that giving is what the system is. And it's much more natural to the human condition, I think, than just taking. And they realize something more important. In this system, it's very primitive because the survival is associated with taking and advantage and getting a job and keeping it and manipulating the environment for your self-interest. That is only beneficial to a certain degree, and that's what we've seen because of the homelessness, because of the wars, because of the poverty, because of the disease epidemics that don't get any treatment, the death of millions of people in Africa that no one cares about. This is the cost of this. So what's going to happen is the consciousness will shift. People will give because they'll recognize that if they don't, this is what's going to happen all over again. So it's in their own self-interest in a different way to actually contribute to society, and that's really the awakening that needs to happen. And that's what the entire element is completely about with the Venus Project and the Zeitgeist Movement, which is a grassroots means to try and get this information out there, get this understanding out there, and get people motivated on a global level to move forward in this direction. I'm not naive enough to think this would happen overnight. I think it would take a few generations.
Well, that's what I'm worried about. Is it all sounds absolutely fantastic. You know, if this could happen and we could all work together for a project such as like the Venus Project. But I think unfortunately the people who are in control at the top have got such like ingrained in, you know, they have such power.
Sure.
And every day you're seeing them take more power. I mean, only this morning I saw something on the TV about taser guns coming in, and that really scares me that these people can, well, police can just shoot people down with these taser guns. Right. So I feel like we're going backwards. There's people pushing to try and go forward, but then you're battling against this all the time. So how do we make that switch?
Because eventually
in a short time, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Well, in the short time, we still have to do the general activism. Yeah. We still have to combat these things on a fundamental level, at a traditional level, traditional protest level, traditional activism level. But I think over time, the power elite is only as powerful as the people that support their system, which is why I advocate at the end of the new film to start boycotting different attributes of the system. For instance, if no one ever joined the military ever again, universally, there'd be no war. There'd be no reason for it, because the military establishment is essentially, the more power one country has, it just means that another country has to get that much power. So you just stop it. Period. You know, for one, war is irrelevant anyway for multiple reasons. But in the end, you know, if they didn't have the military, there would be no grounds for so many different things. They would have no means of control.
Absolutely.
And then the police would eventually go too. Awareness would shift in the human mind, where people that are police officers or military men would say, "Well, wait a minute. Why am I supporting the system when I realize in the long run I'm actually hurting myself?"
And others, your family and people are close to you, yeah.
Of course.
Because who are you fighting against? We're all walking around on the same planet.
Right. And even more profoundly, there really is no they. I really believe. I mean, there are obviously they in a temporal sense. There's an arrogant group of people that have maintained power for long periods of time. They continue to do so. But we still support that. There's really only us. And as long as we focus on the they, on a cognitive level, on a psychic level, so to speak, they will always exist. So until that consciousness awakens as well, until we realize that there really is no they.
Because well, not me personally, but people give them the power.
Yes, they give it up and they support the systems that have been created by them. But it's actually us. So that's one of the more cataclysmic things that people don't really realize on the fundamental level, that there really is no they. So I don't advocate activists that can perpetuate this, you know, we have to battle the New World Order or battle this and that. They don't really get it, as far as I'm concerned. You know, I don't like that. I think they have to realize there's a reason why peace protesters are met with guys with automatic weapons, because they're waiting for the peace protesters to do something to bring them to the level of the men with the automatic weapons so they can use it. They want the conflict. So conflict isn't going to resolve anything. So the more we battle something, the more the battle's going to go on. So that's something that people need to think about.
But we have to do peaceful battles.
Yes, it's more of an awareness.
And spread
shift.
knowledge. Yes, it is. It is about the awareness and making people wake up.
Right.
Wow. Well, I would just love to spend more time with you, and I know we're absolutely on the clock here.
I hope I can come back.
But it's been fantastic. So please come and talk to us again.
Absolutely.
When you come back to England, I hope that's going to be soon. And
hopefully.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.